Hi everyone, I can see people starting to join us. So thank you for joining us this evening for this third in our series of Cosy Homes Oxfordshire webinars. And we're going to be diving into the topic of heat pumps tonight, but I'll just give everyone another 30 seconds, minute to join us. Let everyone find us, but do please pop your name in the chat channel. Let us know if you're here with an organisation or a community group. It's great to know who's out there. We'll get started in a minute. Great. Hi, Rowan. Tom. Oh, and Sally from Abingdon Carbon Cutters. Brilliant. Some homeowners here. Great. Hi, everyone. All right. I can see got lots of attendees, so we'll get cracking. Let everyone else join us as we start. So yeah, thank you for joining us this evening for this Cosy Homes Oxfordshire webinar. And we're going to be giving an overview of how you could use air source or ground source heat pumps to heat your home in a low carbon way. So just quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar with Cosy Homes Oxfordshire, we're a one-stop home retrofit service working to improve the energy efficiency of homes in Oxfordshire with a whole house retrofit approach. And if you want to know more about that, then I would check out the recordings of our previous two webinars in this series, which you can find on our YouTube channel. So home retrofit includes a variety of different measures depending on the home, but it could include heat pumps as a way to reduce the carbon emissions of your heating system. So that's why we're focusing on those tonight. And we're going to be led by Natasha Ginks for this webinar. So Natasha's a real expert in the home energy efficiency field. She's been involved with academic research on energy retrofit interventions, particularly in historic buildings, as well as lecturing on that topic. And she now shares her knowledge and advice on that through her website, Renovate Green. She also has a level 5 diploma in retrofit coordination and risk management, and she's heavily involved in Cosy Homes Oxfordshire as one of our retrofit coordinators. And that means she's advising people on how to retrofit their homes. So Natasha also has first-hand experience of the client side of that process, having undergone a complete retrofit of her own home, which actually included installing a ground source heat pump. So she's really got the whole view of the process. And we're also going to be joined later on in the webinar by Tim Linnell. Tim's also really experienced in that energy and home retrofit sphere, having been previously Chief Executive of the National Energy Foundation, as well as currently being Chair of the Microgeneration Certification Scheme, which verifies the quality of small-scale renewables, such as those that you might find in a home. And tonight, though, Tim joins us as a homeowner who's recently had a heat pump installed in his home, and that's an air source heat pump. And that was to replace his previous oil-fired boiler, meaning that his home is now powered without relying on fossil fuels. So he's going to be sharing his experience as a homeowner in terms of how the installation went, what the impact for his home and himself as a homeowner has been so far. So that's plenty of speaking for me, but before I hand you over to Natasha first, just a couple of quick housekeeping points. So firstly, we are recording tonight's webinar. You're all off camera, so you don't need to worry about that, but the recording will be circulated to you all later this week, as well as anyone else who missed it, couldn't make it in the end. And that will be available on our YouTube channel, as well as all of our other webinar recordings. And then secondly, please do continue to use the chat function during the webinar. If you have any questions or comments, we will stop a couple of times and we should have time at the end of the webinar for any questions and discussion as well. So with that said, I will pass you over to Natasha to get started. Welcome, Natasha.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you tonight. I'm just going to share my screen. Not sure, sorry. I'm going to just stop sharing for a minute and go, sorry. Oh. Sorry, here we go. I hope everyone can see that. Tabitha, is that okay?
Yeah, you're all good.
Brilliant, okay. So this is a guide to heat pumps, and And as Tabitha said, I'll sort of, please put any questions on the chat, and I will, I'll stop at various points to try and answer some questions as we go along. So I'm sure, you know, you'll all have sort of varying different knowledge about heat pumps. But I'll sort of start from the basics and move through to sort of more sort of difficult topics, and also give you some advice on my own, you know, experience of installing installing my own heat pump, and also you know, the advice, you know, when I'm working on other projects, and how other people have installed them and working with the renewable energy companies on it. So there are two types of heat pumps. There's an air source heat pump and a ground source heat pump. Ground source heat is more efficient than air source heat because the ground stays you know, at a more consistent temperature throughout the year, but it is considerably more expensive to install than an air source heat pump, and you know, a lot of people just don't have the space in order to install ground source, but they basically work in the same way, and this diagram here, I'm not going to go into all the sort of technical details as to how they work, but basically heat from low grade heat from the ground or the air passes across an evaporator, and that heat is transferred to a refrigerant, and that refrigerant then passes through a compressor where it's pressurized, and that the process of it being pressurized means that its temperature increases, and then that sort of high temperature, that refrigerant which is now you know, at a high temperature, then passes through the condenser, and at that point, that is where the heat from the refrigerant is transferred to the water in your heating system, and then it sort of goes back and goes back through an expansion valve, and the whole sort of process carries on in a loop. So I'll just move to the next slide. So I've got a couple of photos here. You can see this top photo is a horizontal ground source heat system being put in. This photo is actually quite old, because they used to use these sort of slinky pipes. They tend to use those less now, and they use a sort of a much thicker straight pipe, because they found that that's more efficient. So for ground source heat, you dig down about 1 meter, and you lay the pipe, and then cover it all up again. For an 8 kilowatt heat pump, which would heat a sort of 3 to 4 bedroom house, then you need about 700 square meters of land, so it's quite a lot. And the best type of soil for horizontal ground source heat pumps is basically wet, soggy clay soil, because it holds its temperature better. But if you don't have, you know, sufficient land, then you can always dig down and create boreholes, and there you have to go down about 15-20 meters, and a 8 kilowatt heat pump would require about 1 to 2 boreholes. That is not a very common thing that gets done in the UK, because it is a lot more expensive digging down. You have to have a lot of equipment, and it can add about 20 or 30% to the cost of the installation. So not many people tend to do that. And so ground source heat it's good when the heat load of a house is quite significant, and it's good when the weather's very cold, then it performs well, and it's much more efficient than air source heat. But as I say, it is quite a lot more expensive to do a ground source heat installation than it is an air source heat pump. And it's with the ground source heat, it is the vast majority of the system is obviously hidden, and the sort of the rest of the equipment has to actually be inside. There's no sort of external unit other than what's under the ground. And then so air source heat, which is probably more realistic for most situations, as you'll see this unit here. So this sits on the outside of a building. They're not particularly large, but they're also not particularly attractive either. They need to be located in a place where you've got free airflow. And you wouldn't, it's good to get them, you wouldn't really want to sort of locate them under trees or where sort of debris can get into them. They're actually air source, I mean, a lot of people think that sort of air source heat pumps are significantly worse performing than ground source heat pumps, but actually that isn't always the case. And it's quite, it's really important to look at each house and each occupancy and the different demands of that house to really work out whether the air source heat pump system is going to work. Because actually, if there's high occupancy and the hot water demand is very high, then over the course of a year, an air source heat pump can actually be, in the round, can be as efficient as a ground source heat, because if you've got high hot water demand and you need it throughout the year, then that air source heat pump is going to do very well at heating your hot water in the sort of spring, summer and autumn months. It just won't do quite, it'll be quite hard in the coldest of months it'll have to work hard in the really cold months in order to heat your building, depending on how well insulated it is. I think air source heat pumps, they do require homes to be fairly well insulated, and I'll go on and we'll look at that in a while. And as you can see, that there's an external unit. There's a bit of a noise that comes off it, but again, if it's correctly located, then it doesn't need to. And Tim can talk about this because he's got his located just outside his back door, and he can tell us how noisy it is in a while. So we'll just do the next. So I think a lot of it, I so often get asked this question as to, which houses are suited to heat pumps. And, it's really hard to say, oh, yeah, these houses are and these houses aren't. It really is, it depends, it should be looked at on a case by case basis. But what I've tried to do here is just sort of pull some examples of houses where I think they can work and where I've seen them work well. So obviously they're good with new builds. But having said that, actually, if you are building a passive house, the really, really well insulated houses now, they don't actually have heat pumps in them, because they're so well insulated that the cost of installing a heat pump is ridiculous compared to the amount of heat that they actually need. So if you're building a sort of standard new build, then heat pumps will, it will be appropriate. Passive house, they tend to look at just simply very, very small electric radiators now. And then if you're looking at existing houses which are, that are going to be retrofitted or have been retrofitted, then air source heat pumps in particular will work well if you've got a significant amount of insulation. So definitely loft insulation, and usually some wall insulation as well, either internal or external, and definitely cavity wall. And then, but it's actually, I think it's really, really important that houses that they've got good air tightness. And this is something that's overlooked a little bit, because mainly because it's so hard making existing houses airtight. But it really, I think for heat pumps to heat houses well, it's really, really important to focus on the drafts and stopping the drafts, and just making sure that the heat isn't escaping, because it's at lower temperatures than with a house heated with oil or gas, and therefore you really do need to make sure that heat doesn't escape. But then interestingly, houses with thick walls and very solid floors, they can actually be effectively heated with ground source heat pumps in particular. There's one particular company called ISO Energy who really focus on old traditional buildings and using heat pumps to heat them. And it's the thermal mass in those buildings which enables the sort of low grade constant heat which sort of seeps into that structure and enables them to be heated quite efficiently. And I think it's a common thing that everyone does when you're heating your houses off oil or gas. You tend to, you program that heat to come on a couple of times a day. And the number of times, I've been told by sort of heating engineers that the best thing is to, leave the heating on all the time and let the whole structure warm up. And you can never bear to do that when you're burning gas and oil constantly. But that is the concept of the heat pump, in that it is on continually and it heats up the whole building. And if that building has got a lot of thermal mass or it's airtight, then it can the temperature will remain in the house, and that is one of the sort of really important things, the big differences between heat pumps and other forms of heating. And then obviously sort of older houses with modern extensions, again, they can be heated quite effectively, mainly because, if you've taken a large sort of area of the house and enclosed that in a more, in an extension which is sort of much more, have much lower heat loss, then you'll be able to, that can effectively, they can be good for heat pumps for heating them. And then I just said houses with compact form. So if you've got a very sort of, a long straggly house with loads of different sort of walls and not a very compact form, then again, it's a little bit harder for a heat pump to heat them. Tabitha, do you want to stop? Should we stop there and just see if there's any questions?
Yes, sure. We've had lots of kind of practical questions, lots of curiosity about what a heat pump is actually like to have in your home. So maybe Tim can come in on a couple of these as well. But we've had a question about do you know the dimensions of a standard air source heat pump unit, and could you stand it upright rather than long ways?
Yes, so they are a sort of standard unit is probably about, well, I mean, it all depends on the size of, the size of your house and the size of a heat pump, but it is about, about 1.5, maybe 1.5 meters across and about a meter tall or something. And they have to, you can sort of put them at different, stand them up or have them sitting down in a different way as well. And you just have to find a place where it's not too, obstructive or obtrusive on your house. Yeah,
great. And a question about the noise as well. So someone's asked if an air source heat pump unit is loud enough for semi-detached neighbours to hear it.
So actually, we're just in the process of putting a heat pump, installing it on a semi-detached property, and so heat pumps, they fall within permitted development rules, right? So you can put a heat pump on your house without having to get planning permission, but you have to make sure that it's a metre or more away from the boundary of your house, and also there are rules that say that it has to be below a certain noise level, so a decibel level, and as long as you're below that, then it falls within permitted development, and people actually can't sort of oppose it, and they're really, and it's on your house, so you're going to be as bothered by it as your neighbour is, and they're not that noisy, but it is something that you have to be aware of, that they do.
I mean, shall I come in on that particular one? Yeah, as my wife would say to everyone, I'm actually really pretty sensitive to mechanical type noises around. I kind of, it's one of my bugbears of kind of our world having too many mechanical noises, whether it's lorries reversing, whether it's aircraft above and things like that. So I'm actually pretty sensitive, and it was one of the things that I was potentially concerned about. And you'll see when the photos later, we've started it slightly to one side, so it's not kind of in the back garden, so you're sitting right next to it. So I would say you wouldn't want to put it right by where you're going to sit and have your outside lunch and and regularly being out there. But you can barely hear it, and certainly the more modern ones now. And again, we'll talk about kind of how the technology's improved. It's just a slight whir. But as I would. I'd almost tempted to kind of, it's on at the moment, so I could almost tempt to take it down to sort of show over the computer. It really, it was one of the things, particularly a decade ago when I looked at it, that I was thinking, last thing I want is a kind of humming noise. But the more of it is, in fact, more of a noise, and I said I'm sensitive to noises, around the hot water cylinder and the pumping the water inside than there is outside. So on the scale of things, of household appliances that we've got, whether it's fridges or freezers or things like that, air source heat pumps are not noisy things, is what I'd say.
That's good to hear.
I've had a couple of questions about, I know you said air tightness is important kind of before you think about installing a heat pump, and there's a couple of questions about that. Does air tightness cause problems with damp and mold? Is that a worry in pandemic times? How to deal with a partner who does like to open windows in the winter? Yeah. Okay,
well, I'll just quickly do. I mean, yes, you're very, very right. Air tightness can be, it can be very problematic if you're not installing, a sort of controlled ventilation system at the same time. So you have to be very careful with sealing up homes and making them as airtight as possible. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to stop the uncontrolled air infiltration, and then have a controlled ventilation system. And as long as you've got that in place, then your indoor air quality will be fine. But you are right with that, definitely. Sorry, Tim. Yeah.
Well, I was going to add in there's a little bit of kind of the personal bits of it, because again, I would say that that we as a family, we are definitely not someone that likes to live in a hermetically sealed house. We're kind of quite the reverse of that. But it's that control that you talked about. So having triple glazed windows now actually is much quieter generally around. But when you want to have it open, then you have it open. And so we've got a room that we use much more later, which we'll come to. But that's got a big sliding triple glazed window. So on days where we want fresh air, when it's warm outside, we actually have more ventilation, more usable ventilation for when we want it than we had before. So it's that bit about it's uncontrolled rather than controlled. I think that air tightness is when you need it warm, you keep it warm, but actually at other times having the ability to open it is absolutely there.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So these, I'm just going to quickly run through what I think are quite challenging houses to heat with heat pumps. Old timber frame houses are very tricky because they tend to have very thin walls. They've got wattle and daub often. They don't have the thermal mass. So I would be pretty careful about installing a heat pump on an old timber framed house. Likewise, I think single skin Victorian houses are quite tricky as well. And the Victorians built their houses in quite a rush, in the industrial era, and they tend not to hold their heat very, very well. So I think you would, on a Victorian house, I think you would have to do a fair amount of wall insulation in order to make sure that that you could heat the house to the required temperature, and not a huge expense of running your heat pump. So and then, as I said before, drafty houses with leaky windows, I think you would have to do quite a lot of work to make sure your windows and just on the air tightness before installing the heat pump. Again, uninsulated suspended timber floors, they would need to be insulated prior to doing your putting your heat pump, because you lose so much heat through them. And also, I think houses that suffer damp, I mean, it's tricky this because obviously it takes a lot more energy to heat a damp house than it does to heat a dry house. But also, actually, a heat pump with its constant heat can actually do wonders to, you know, kind of solving damp problems. But again, you know, you would want to sort out any sort of damp issues really before you put the heat pump in. Okay, so these are sort of these are some sort of common misconceptions about heat pumps that I've had myself, and also that clients I've talked to have been surprised about. But so heat pumps are actually, they're weather compensated, which means that they're controlled by the outside temperature. So unlike a lot of the way that a gas and an oil boiler often works is that you've got an internal thermostat, and that's the thing that's controlling whether it's coming on or off. But with heat pumps, it's literally to do with the outdoor temperature. And so when the outdoor temperature falls below a certain point, then the heat pump comes on, and it essentially stays on. And I mean, for building regulations, it does require you to have an indoor thermostat, but actually the heat pump is really controlled by the weather outside, not by that internal thermostat. And they do, and this is another thing that sort of people sometimes find quite hard to get their head around. They do tend to stay on the whole time through the heating system, but through the heating season. I mean, I switch our heat pump off in the summer. I don't actually need to do that because the weather compensator would just sort of turn it off, but I do it anyway. They tend to stay on all the time, and you can have them. You can have them on a night setting, so they sort of work less hard during the night if you don't want the house to be so warm. But that they are on most of the time, depending on the outside temperature. They do work with radiators as well as underfloor heating. Air source heat pumps in particular work most efficiently with underfloor heating because it requires a lower temperature. So underfloor heating will usually come on about 35 degrees. Radiators tend to be more like 45 degrees running through them. So, but there are plenty of heat pump installations done, with radiators. And I think, Tim, you've got both, haven't you? You've got radiators and underfloor. Yeah, that's right. Yep, and you have to get used to the fact that your radiators don't feel nice and piping hot, so you can't come in and sort of feel really cold and put your hands on them and think, oh wow, that feels so nice and hot. So because they do that, heat pumps generate a much lower temperature that goes through the radiators. And then in terms of the running costs, I think this is quite important, that if you're replacing an oil boiler or LPG, then you will see you'll see your fuel bills fall. If you're replacing a gas boiler at the moment, you're unlikely to see your fuel bills fall, but you'll obviously see your emissions fall. And actually, I mean, definitely when we installed our ground source heat, we switched from mains gas to ground source, and actually I've been very sort of conscious of monitoring the my heating bills, and actually they have actually come down, and I think that must be from the fact that because it's on constantly, so the house is always kept to a good temperature, whereas before I did that sort of typical thing of turning the gas boiler off and on all the time, which meant that it had to work extra hard to get back up to the required temperature. So yeah, I think it's really important when you do an installation is to make sure that the installer gives you running cost estimates. I think that's and they always should do that under sort of MCS. Okay, so do's and don'ts of heat pumps. So yeah, I think it is important, particularly with air source heat pump, to carry out installation and air tightness improvements beforehand. Make sure that the heat pump is optimised to the UK climate. You know, any good heat pump installer will sort of only recommend heat pumps which are right for your house and your area. But it is important that, because otherwise you've got them, if they have to constantly defrost because they're not optimized for the UK climate, then they use more and more electricity. Yeah, this is quite important actually, to check your sort of your electrical capacity, because heat pumps actually require a lot of electricity, and if you're installing anything, if you're installing more than sort of a 15 kilowatt heat pump, then that actually needs its own supply of single phase electricity. So it's, you know, most people have sort of 100 amps coming into their house, and you just have to be quite careful that once you've got your heat pump running, and you know, if you've got a electric cooker and you've got your car charging, or you've got your kettle boiling, it's really important that, you know, things aren't going to trip, because there are too many things drawing on that electrical load. So you know, lots of people, I mean, it is possible to upgrade your electrical load, but you know, that's another additional expense. So it's something that you've got to think about early on. They do require a hot water tank and other equipment, and I'll probably leave that up to Tim to tell us a bit more about that. But yes, so if you're switching from a combi boiler to a heat pump, you have to be aware of the fact that you've got to have enough space within your house for a hot water tank. There are some sort of smaller versions now which combine the sort of the condenser and the hot water tank, but in general, you know, you need a bit of space. I think I've covered, make sure you request running cost estimates, and again, in conservation areas, just check the rules. A lot of conservation areas will, you know, they'll allow heat pumps as part of permitted development, but you know, it's always good to just double check that. And then the don'ts of heat pumps. So I really wouldn't go for the cheapest quote on a heat pump. I think the design and the installation is absolutely key to good performance. And actually, the Energy Saving Trust did a research project over about 6 years, working out, you know, investigating how heat pumps were performing relative to what they said they did on the packet, and some of them massively underperformed, and some of them actually quite significantly overperformed. And the conclusion was that a lot of that time that was down to how they had been installed. So I think it's really important that you make sure you go for somebody who really who's done it quite a lot, and they really know what they're talking about. Yeah, be careful not to undersize your hot water tank, because it takes longer to heat a tank of water using a heat pump than it does using gas or oil. So just watch for that one. Yeah, make sure it's much more efficient if the heat pump's located close to the plant room. And I'm sure no one would do this, but don't buy online and install yourself. You need your installer to be MCS registered in order to get the grants and everything. Okay, so I'm going to quickly, I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to run over, but why are they good for the environment? I mean, Tim and I had a quick 10-minute chat before this, saying that, you know, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, the heat pumps weren't necessarily massively better for the environment, because you know, the grid electricity hadn't decarbonised to the level that it has today. So I think that is one of the reasons why heat pumps have become so much more attractive, is because actually the electricity that's used to power them has so much fewer emissions attached to it than even 5 years ago. Also, it's quite nice that you're not producing any emissions locally, so you've got cleaner air, and I think that's definitely true if you're replacing an oil boiler. The efficiencies of them, you know, air source and ground source heat pumps, they can be 250 to 350% efficient compared to some of the best gas boilers at 90%. So if you combine them with solar PV, they can reduce your grid electricity consumption. Again, I think you have to be a bit careful with that, with managing that, because you have to remember that the heat pumps are working really, really hard in the winter months when the solar PV isn't necessarily generating that much. But again, they can be, in the spring and autumn months, solar PV can reduce your electricity consumption, and also for the hot water. And then, also I think, anything that we can do to phase out oil in terms of making sure it doesn't get transported across the world, and with all the risk of spills and everything, is a good thing. And then I'm just going to quickly, are we all right for time, Tabitha?
Yeah, you're okay.
Yeah, just about, okay. So I'll quickly run through, there are a couple of grants for heat pumps. I'm sure you've all heard about the renewable heat incentive. This pays quarterly over 7 years. There's a non-domestic one as well, which can apply to houses with sort of annexes or outbuildings, but in general, most people are on the domestic tariff. So they pay quarterly over 7 years. It's based on the annual heat and hot water demand of your house. Although that is actually capped now. So for air source heat pumps, it's capped at 20,000 kilowatt hours. For ground source, it's capped at 30,000 kilowatt hours. So you can get your payment up. It doesn't mean to say that if your house requires more than that, you can still install the heat pump. They'll just only pay up to that annual heat demand. And it does if your house has got cavities, then it would require the cavities to be filled, and it also requires the loft to be adequate, properly insulated. Solid walls houses can have heat pumps installed on them. It's not a requirement to have internal or external wall insulation. And then importantly, the payments are actually attached to the house. So, if you install a heat pump and you get your RHI, and then 3 years later you move, then those payments carry on going to the house. They don't come to you as the person who paid for the heat pump in the first place. And then the Green Homes Grant, which is the one that everyone's talking about at the moment. The heat pumps are actually, they're part of the primary measures. So you can use your greenhouse grant voucher to help pay for the installation costs of your heat pump. That's great because it pays up front, which means you can, it's a decent contribution to the installation. And actually it doesn't preclude you applying for the RHI. It just, the amount that you get, the voucher amount is actually deducted from the RHI payments. So there's a bit of flexibility there. I think in general, the installers I've talked to, they're sort of saying if you're doing sort of installation works as well, the best thing to do is to use the voucher for your installation works, and then get the full RHI for your heat pump. Okay, and then just the last slide. These are a couple of things that I've mainly from my own experience. Actually, I think it's, and actually I didn't have this on our heat pump because we had it installed quite a few years ago, but I think it's really important to make sure that your heat pump can be programmed to heat your hot water independently from the heating. And I say this is because in the summer months, if you've got some solar, for instance, you actually want to make sure that the solar, that the solar is running the heat pump at the time and heating the hot water when it's actually when the electricity is being produced during the daytime. So you want to make sure that you can program that heat pump to heat the hot water at the right time. Again, I mentioned the thing about watching your electricity supply. I mean, some people, so this house that we're just doing the heat pump on one of them, what we're doing the heat pump on at the moment, they've actually got to keep their gas supply for their cooker because they don't actually, their electricity supply isn't big enough when they've got their heat pump and everything else running. So that's just something to bear in mind. It's, yeah, make sure you carry on monitoring your electricity tariff, because you know, you are using electricity, and it's expensive when you're using that to heat your house. Yeah, and then this other thing, they can complement wood burners quite nicely in rural areas for those really, you know, those days where it's really, really cold. The wood burner can just, you know, if the heat pump is kind of not quite getting you up to temperature, and I'm talking about days when it's, you know, -5 outside or something, then a wood burner can really do sort of wonders in just kind of bringing that temperature up inside. And then also we're seeing we're seeing people, as I say, combining them with solar PV, looking at battery storage as well. And then this is just a sort of point that, you know, if you're thinking of installing underfloor heating now, just make sure, and even if you're not thinking of a heat pump at the moment, try and make sure that underfloor heating is going to be compatible with the heat pump in the future, because it's an expensive thing to put in, the underfloor heating, and therefore if you're going to have to switch to a heat pump in the future, it'd be nice just to be able to do it without adjusting the underfloor heating. And I think that's it.
Great, thank you, Natasha. I think, should we go straight on to Tim? Do you want to share a little bit of your experience of having your air source heat pump installed, and then we've got a bit of time for questions at the end.
Yeah, grand. Just need to stop sharing so I can share, Natasha.
Yeah.
Perfect. Grand. Hopefully people can see that as well. So I will. I haven't got so many slides, and just really just give us sort of a flavour of things, really. And there we go. So why is it that we sort of went down the route of an air source heat pump? We actually did look at this some decade or so ago, because we're an off gas community, so you've got no option for gas in the first place. When we looked, so we really are keen to get off oil. Interesting if you talk about oil spills, because my early part of my environmental career was actually responding to oil spills, Natasha. So you absolutely know that from first hand. I was up at the Brer incident in Shetland. I was over in Sea Empress. I know what happens when oil gets spilt at sea. It makes a mess. So I am absolutely, that's one of the motivations, is kind of get off oil. Absolutely. Really, when we looked at it 10 years ago, then the grids, the electricity was higher in carbon content, so we didn't feel like we were making such a big saving if we moved to an air source heat pump, particularly in a building which needed that that insulation work done to it, and so we didn't go for it. That's 10 years ago, and we actually weren't keen on biomass, particularly my wife wasn't so keen on the wood pellet side of things, the physical part that's involved. So we ended up just upgrading the oil boiler to a condensing oil boiler, and that's only the minimum you can do. But we've always wanted to make this happen, and with Cosy Homes, we had that assessment, which Natasha in fact came and did for us, and we found out that we can actually now, with the improving insulation and the technology advances, it actually works in our home. We had done quite a lot of other things in terms of making sure that the basic installation had been done, and we had solar PV panels and solar thermal panels, so how can we make sure we work with that? So that was the kind of motivations of why we wanted to do it. Just some pictures of some different parts of it. So, we talked about kind of how aesthetically pleasing is an air source heat pump. Well, I put it to you that left-hand side, a stocking great 1200 litre oil tank is a good deal less aesthetically pleasing than a 1 metre by 1 metre air source heat pump. It sits there out in the drive. I saw in the chat people said, how far can you have it from your home? Our home is actually, does my arrow come across on the screen or not? Can you see my arrow moving? Yeah, so this is the driveway here, and so to the left is actually separated therefore by about 3 metres. In this case is the air source heat pump. really well insulated pipe that comes in sort of down the drive and across. That's partly to kind of make sure it was in a space which wasn't, we've got a very small garden, so that's why ground source heat pump really wasn't an option. And it also did remove it from being, you know, right where we are in our small back garden. The ideal in terms of efficiency is to have that link as short as possible, but actually, again, the technology has improved, so as 2 or 3 meters, really well insulated thermal pipe works absolutely fine as well. So that's kind of aesthetics around the air source heat pump itself and where it was located. As I said, we're delighted to have that out there, and you'll see it's actually on a drive that comes past. I've already had quite a few conversations with people going, "Oh, what's that there? Why is that? You know, what's replacing the oil tank there?" So, you know, again, it's got people thinking about it. So that's good in itself. Hot water tank, we definitely did not undersize our hot water tank. I'll be honest, it was slightly larger than we anticipated. It was partly because actually it was a supply part of it. It was originally going to be one that was going to be about this height, so 200 litre tank. This is a 300 litre one. But actually, to echo what Natasha was saying, you know, particularly as we've got solar thermal panels that can top up in the winter, I've had the solar thermal panel since 2005. But I think it's interesting, even though it was in September that we've had it installed, I could already see in that short period of warm weather that we had, I can now use my solar thermal panels much more efficiently because I can heat this hot water tank over time and really capture all that solar thermal. And as Natasha was saying, it also just means that you've got that thermal, you know, the store there for the air source heat pump if you're taking your PV to heat it as well. So yeah, it's not a small cylinder, but actually if you can tuck it away in the corner like that, it really does help on the efficiency. So absolutely endorse what Natasha was saying there. And then the insulation part of it, so the front of the house is solid stone, it's ironstone. The back of the house is an extension in the sort of mixture of 70s and things. And so it was interesting in the survey that Natasha did, it was interesting that this central portion of the house where actually we had an extension in 1996, making sure we were meeting building regs. That was in my life actually at that point as doing oil spill response, so I wasn't in the energy and building side. So I didn't know to insist that not only are you meeting building regs from 1996, you should need to go above it if you really want a properly insulated home, which I find really quite staggering in one sense, that the bit from 1996 out of when you've got so many different parts of the home is the one that needed addressing, but absolutely needed, we found that that's a room that used to get cold. This area here, again, double glazed units there that have basically started to fail. So the combination of the insulation that you see in that middle bit of doing the room upstairs, including having the ceiling, the insulated, and it was quite shocking when you saw that to meet building regs in 96, you could actually cope, you had 100 mils of fiberglass, and that met the building regs at the time, and therefore it's not surprising that was actually made it a cold room in the winter. So you'll see on the right hand side the kind of the way in which now the insulation is then covered over with just a scree. The sort of colouring kind of matches the ironstone which is around the front of the house, so complements that. It kind of unifies, I think, the house in a way which that kind of the bits that it didn't sort of unify it in that same kind of way. But I tell you, these rooms now, particularly this room here at the bottom that used to get far too hot in the summer, get the heat gain because this is south facing here, and already we're seeing how much better it is for heat insulation and sound insulation. I was actually just saying earlier, I had to say I had always thought that triple glazing was something that was nice to have rather than made a significant difference. The windows we replaced with triple glazing compared to the double glazing units we've had around, I would say to anyone now, if you're having glazing done, go for triple glaze. It is just so much better in terms of the kind of the thermal insulation. We noticed the changes of condensation and sound insulation. I think that was the last slide. Yeah, so it was really just, that hopefully gives a feel for the combination of an air source heat pump and the insulation work. we definitely find now the house so much more comfortable to be in, even though we've only had it for a month in that period of time. And the insulation we really notice. We have got a wood burner, so that on those very cold days we would use it for that, but also partly to make sure that the air source heat pump can be efficient as well, because the time when it is not so efficient is if it's having to work very hard. So I certainly plan to use the wood stove partly to make sure that the air source heat pump's not having to work hard to kind of do that base lifting of the temperature as well.
Tim, I've just got one question for you. Thank you for that. Did you have to, how many radiators did you have to replace, or did you not have to replace any?
So basically this ground floor wasn't an insulated floor. So actually that was the other bit. We insulated their floor, and at that point we also put in underfloor heating for that part of it. So there's one zone which is underfloor heating. The rest of it, we've actually, the radiators were a significant size. So we have left at the moment all the radiators as the same size. Now what we've talked about again, Cotswold Green Energy, who are the installers that we've done, are fantastic and really experienced. And in Norton as a community, they've done quite a lot of different installations. And what Charlie McKinnon-Little there said, look, should work, but actually just wait and see how that goes. If there are some rooms where there's an issue, then we just come back and we actually change the size of the radiators. But apart from there was a very small radiator in this room on the top side here that was replaced with a larger one. That was the only one where we had to replace that, and that radiator actually went into the airing cupboard. I saw a question about airing cupboards, and therefore you can just run the system in the same kind of way, where you just make sure in the summer we've already run it in that way, where everything else is turned off, and you just run the air source heat pump that was just through that small radiator that's now in the airing cupboard, and so you've got an airing cupboard running as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it is all to do with the surface area of the radiators, and I found quite often that people sort of think, I'm going to have to replace all my radiators, but actually when the installers come in and they do their heat loss calculations, often they may replace a couple of radiators, but it's not always the case. And actually, when we installed our ground source, we didn't replace a single radiator.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Tim, for sharing your experience. I think it does just kind of help to hear from a homeowner about how and why it's made sense for your home. And thank you as well, Natasha, for a really well-informed presentation. I think you can tell from the amount of questions and comments that you've really sparked people's curiosity. So we do have a couple minutes left. I've seen one question come up a couple of times, which is about hybrid heat pumps and whether that's something that you'd recommend.
Yeah, I can just quickly talk about that. They're quite new to the market, and as a result, they're very expensive. But actually the government did some research on them, and it did find that they can actually be very, they can work with the heat pump. The combination of the traditional system and the heat pump can be very good in those periods when the heat pump is having to work really hard and it switches over to the traditional boiler. So it is that the research is out there. It's saying that they can be effective, but at the moment the price tag is just a little bit too high. And as I understand it, you can get the RHI with a hybrid system, but it obviously only pays for the element of the heating that is done through the heat pump and not through the traditional.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we've had lots of other questions. I'm trying to think which ones are.
There's one I've just seen which I can answer very quickly, which was about the kind of, will the air source heat pump provide hot water at reasonable temperature all year round? And certainly, that's because we're not really properly into the heating season now. We've occasionally just topped up a little bit. I can say the hot water in that intermediate stage absolutely does that. Tops up whatever comes from the solar thermal. It's gets to whatever it gets to. I think it's 55 or whatever the temperature is normally from a that you'd need for domestic situations. I did answer in the chat, because it's a slightly lower temperature than sometimes you get from a gas or oil. There's an automatic Legionella thing that comes in for a couple of hours every week, Mine's a Tuesday evening between sort of 2 and 4, where it takes up to 70 to make sure there's no Legionella issue. And again, as long as you're getting it installed by a reputable installer, an MCS installer, that will be done as part of it. I mean, you know, you'd have to be a pretty poor installer not to make that happen. I think it's part of the standard thing, but that absolutely is in there.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I don't think we have time for any more questions. I have seen quite a few that are specific questions about your homes, which is great to know that you're thinking about it. I would say if you've got a question specific to your home, or generally any questions that we haven't had time to answer that you'd still like us to answer, do just drop us an email. I'll put the email in the chat, but it's just info@cosyhomesoxfordshire.org, and I'll make sure we answer it. But yeah,
I mean, certainly what I'd say, Tabitha, is I think it's good to keep the time so that those that need to go. If there's anyone that wants to stay on for another 10-15 minutes and ask questions and in that interactive way, I'm certainly very happy to stay on. So, you know, once you close up, if there's anyone that wants to stay on and ask a question, I'm happy to stay on for the next 10-15 minutes to answer any questions.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Tim. If anyone does want to do that, if you just pop your name or question or whatever in the chat, because I can unmute you once we finish up, and you can actually discuss. Great. All right. So I'll just do the kind of closing bit, and then if anyone does want to stay, you're very welcome. So yeah, before we sign off, we do have one more webinar in this series, which is kind of similar to the format of tonight, but looking at insulation as a retrofit measure. And as we've heard tonight from both Tim and Natasha, insulation is one of those measures that will kind of support anything else you're doing, including heat pumps, by reducing that heat loss. And it's also included in the Green Homes Grant. So it's worth considering. So that webinar's on Tuesday, the 20th of October. So that's a fortnight's time, in the same time as this. I'll include the registration link for that on the follow-up email, for anyone who hasn't yet registered and is interested to. And otherwise, it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to both Natasha and Tim for joining us tonight to share their knowledge, their experience with us all. And a huge thank you to all of you as well, our audience, for coming along and for asking such perceptive questions. But yeah, that's it for tonight. So thank you for coming. Hopefully see you next time. If you just click leave the webinar, and anyone who wants to stay and ask any additional questions, please do. But yeah, thank you all.
Tabitha, are you still there? Yes.
Yeah, we'll just stay on. There's a couple people saying they want to stay on.
Yeah, there's one question from Paige Newmark about installing underfloor heating in a listed building, which I don't know if Paige is still there. I could answer that one.
Yeah, I think, is that Paige Newmark? She said she'll stay on. I can allow her to talk if you want. Do you want to ask your question, Paige?
Hi, Natasha. So it's Paige, a male, not a female.
Sorry.
Yes, I'm in a very old grade 2 listed building, and it's got these horrible radiators from the 70s. And obviously we want to upgrade insulation, and the heat pump does sound like an option. Obviously we've got to cost it out. I would have to start again with all the heating in here because it's way too old. What are you recommending in terms of the type of heater that would go best with the heat source pump? I mean, Tim talked underfloor heating. Would one put hot water pipes throughout the house? What would one do?
Well, so you've got no, at the moment it's all storage heaters, is it?
Very expensive, very old.
Yeah.
I'm embarrassed to tell you how much my electricity bill is.
So your floors, are they, what are they like? Are they solid? Are they historic? I mean,
yeah, they're historic, wood floors upstairs and downstairs. It's
okay. So they're wooden, are they?
Wood upstairs, stone downstairs.
Okay. So I think you would, from a listed, with it being a listed building, I think you would struggle to get authorization to pull up those floors, and I'd be very careful in old traditional buildings like that. I'm not worried about the upstairs floors, but the ground floors, the solid floors, where they'll basically be sitting on on soil underneath them, and you do have to be pretty careful about pulling those up and insulating, and then sort of putting underfloor heating in, because it is, you can then force the moisture that is essentially in the ground under your house, you can force that up the walls, and so in general, if you were going to do that, you would have to do something, you'd have to put something like a limecrete floor down, which is a vapor permeable floor, and they're notoriously difficult to put down, and they're also very, very expensive. So if I was you, I would think about radiators rather than underfloor.
Even upstairs?
Well, I think if you're putting radiators downstairs, then you would put them upstairs as well. I mean, you do see people putting up underfloor heating upstairs, but it tends to, I mean, the great thing about underfloor heating is when you've got a stone floor underneath it, and it sort of, you get a radiant heat from it. So I think it would be, I think if you were doing radiators downstairs, you would extend that upstairs as well. But I mean, yes, I wouldn't, I don't know what you'd think, Tim, but I think it sounds, in a listed building, it's tricky to pull up the.
Yeah, I mean, although I guess what I'd say, and Paige, in your type of building, it really is one which is, you need a retrofit coordinator there, and you need somebody there to go and have a look at them and have a look. And you might find there's some part of the building where it does work, and certainly that's what we've got radiators most of the time. But because and it was the bit, and again it's in the bit which is a slight extension. So I don't know whether in your home you've got everything that was built at the same time, or you've got different bits there. So you might well find there are some zones, and certainly it's in the kitchen zone, and it works really well. And we've not, as I said, not had to have the heating on very often, but occasional bits where you had that, it is such a pleasure to have in the kitchen area where you've got tiles on the floor, that radiant heat that Natasha's talking about. So definitely agree with what Natasha's saying about radiators generally, but a mixed system can also potentially work, particularly when you're starting from scratch. But it is, your classic case, you said you'd sort of do some costing and things like that. Paige, just getting an expert from the start. I think for this kind of thing, it doesn't have to be Cosy Homes if you feel there's another route there. I think having used Cosy Homes as a customer, I would definitely go down that route personally and recommend that through our community. But it's only wherever you go, I wouldn't do too much work yourself. It is one where for your kind of building, you need an expert, and so get a retrofit coordinator in.
Okay, you're both very kind. Thank you.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions from Andy on storage and on the river locally. Let me find, he is still here, brilliant. I think you should be able to talk now, Andy, if you want to ask your questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm on gas grid. I have an EPC of B with a combi boiler. Just over the other side of the fence, I have the River Banwell. If I could get riparian rights from the local council, how would you recommend that I proceed to gather the heat from the river and then bring it in? I should add, I already have 6.5 kilowatts of solar PV and a sun amp heat battery, which takes the excess generation from solar PV and stores that in the solar PV. I really welcome the panel's recommendations.
Well, you've done very well, Andy. I'm impressed with all the things you've got. I can't say that I've ever been involved in heat pumps where the pipes are sunk in a river, but I do know that there are cases where it has been successful, and actually they can achieve really high efficiency levels. But I think it obviously depends on things like the flow of the river, the depth of it, does the river, does it have is it always consistently full of water?
It never freezes. It never freezes.
And what about in summer? Does it?
Yeah, it's flowing all the time. We're about 2 miles from the river with the River Severn, and so we get a regular flow coming down, taking all the excess water from the Weston-super-Mare area down the River Banwell and out into the Severn.
Yeah. I mean, I think I don't know very much about this, but I imagine that the hardest thing would be getting the rights over it, and being able to sink the pipe work and then not worry about, I don't know, it getting punctured or damaged by passing traffic, river traffic or anything like that. But I don't know how you go about doing that.
And what about the heat battery I already have, the Sunup heat battery? That has phase change material in it, so it's a lot more condensed than a normal storage tank. The phase change material melts at 58 degrees C. Is a heat pump able to get up to 58 degrees C?
Well, it can, but it'll cost you a lot in terms of electricity.
Okay, well, with that in mind, I also have Economy 10, which gives me cheap off-peak electricity between midnight and 5 a.m. and 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. Could I potentially run the heat pump during those times and then store the generated heat to satisfy my demand during peak times?
Tim, you go.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that, again, this is more where in my MCS, I guess one of the things is that, given you've got your storage for electricity use, the relative value and pricing of electricity compared to heat, only if you're having to export a lot of electricity would I say it's worth considering that in terms of changing it to heat and going through that. It feels to me like the systems you've got already, as Natasha was saying, the starting point would be, can you get access to the river? And then if you can, then get back in touch. We don't, so you're not in the Cosy Homes Oxfordshire area, but I'd be happy to, through wearing my MCS at the Microgeneration National thing, put you in contact there. But because it is a very interesting one, there are very few examples in the UK of the kind of water source in one sense rather than ground source.
I'd like to thank the panel very much indeed for your interaction and your advice. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Andy. And then last question I can see is Rowan, who is still here, brilliant, who is going from oil to air source heat pump and buying new radiators next week. Rowan, you should be able to speak, I think.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, I'm doing a renovation, a wraparound extension around a fairly small house, but I'm just about to buy all new radiators next week to go in. Just hearing that discussion about increased radiator surface area, I've done the standard calculations and lifted those margins by 20% in anticipation of a lower temperature requirement in the future. I just say, is that 20% a reasonable guess, or would you go higher over what you would have for a normal, I'm on oil at the moment, heating system?
I'm not sure I can give you a sort of definitive answer on that, actually, Rowan. I think it really depends on where the radiator is going to be located, and I think, have you got an installer? Have you got an MCS installer helping you?
No, I haven't got to the air source heat pump in yet. I'm currently operating with an aging oil boiler.
Yes.
I've put a new A+ water tank in, 210 litres. So I'm sort of getting ready towards the air source heat pump, and
yes,
I'm looking at it. To be honest, the green scheme has sort of accelerated my plans of doing it before the oil boiler has actually died. So I just wanted, I'm just trying to prep myself for the future.
I know, I can see that. Yeah.
Downstairs in all the new areas have all got underfloor heating. But where I have got radiators, I sort of up the capacity a touch, but wondering, when we're based on the previous discussion, was that touch a sort of fair ballpark figure, or would you say no, go up by 50% for operating at a lower temperature?
Shall I mean, I think Natasha's being sort of very polite, but I think the advice actually is very. I'll be more blunt, Rowan. You need to get the air source, the heat pump installer in there to have a look now before you buy the radiators. I think it would be a grave mistake for you to go out and you make your estimates without having someone. I mean, it'd be better if you can get a retrofit coordinator in there that can look at the kind of insulation, that sort of thing. But it sounds like if you're doing a wraparound, the installation will be there. But the design and sizing, as Natasha said in her, is such a critical part of the heat pump and how that works as well. I think you would be taking a big risk, and I certainly wouldn't recommend you go out and do anything about the radiators before you at least get one air heat. I don't know if there's ground source of the air source you're thinking about, but if you get a heat source, heat pump installer in there to give you their estimate, and get an MCS one. I mean, they're not all MCS ones, but get an MCS installer in there to give you a quote. And yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. I'll try and do that before we freeze.
Okay.
We haven't got any at the moment.
Yeah.
Whereabouts are you, Rowan?
I'm at Eastcote, actually, in over the border in Northamptonshire.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just near Toaster.
Yeah, okay, I know.
Well, we have got retrofit coordinators that's a sort of outside Oxford to the north. So again, if you, it's £175 to have a whole house plan done. I don't know. We could try and prioritise if it's an immediate thing to get done. So if you get pay £175 for a whole house plan, as part of that, you get that kind of advice. And we could kind of try and fast track the heat loss calculation so you can get that early information. I hear entirely what you're saying. That's the kind of the timing of it will make it work. But
no, very interested in that, actually. Yeah, where do I go and to follow that option up?
Tabitha, do you want to link up directly with Tabitha and she'll link in there to do that?
Okay. Right.
Yeah. I should be able to message you direct, Rowan. I'll just send you my email address. And if you drop me an email, then we can get you through the system. Okay,
that'd be great. Okay, thank you.
But and again, to enforce how well that can work, I've got a good friend in the community here who's involved in low carbon stuff, who did that actually in terms of a wraparound an older building with, and then in fact, he went for underfloor heating around it and a couple of air source heat pumps, and he went in at the stage where it was early stage of getting PV panels and things up there. So he actively now gets paid by the government to heat his home. So it's and that wraparound and getting the insulation worked really well. So I think what you're doing is a really great approach. So go with it, but just get that advice at this stage, I'd say.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Great, thanks, Rowan. I haven't seen any other questions since people stayed on. I don't think, no. So I think that's it for now. Unless, either of you have anything additional you want to say?
No.
That's gone there. Great to have the questions coming in. Lots of people thinking. It's brilliant to see lots of people thinking about it for different options. So that's great.
I know, it's good, really good.
Really
that Michael Shepherd's raised a hand.
Oh, how can you see that? Oh,
I don't know. I think probably because you got me as a code.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm allowing you to talk, Michael. Good spot, Tim.
Yeah, I enjoyed everything that's gone on tonight, but I felt what I had done got completely missed out, which is that it's possible using an air-to-air heat pump to do one room at a time. And that has a very low capital cost compared with doing a whole house. And we've successfully escaped from using a gas fire in our living room by using an air source heat pump. And I was very pleased with the results. but wouldn't it be worth possibly sharing that as an option? I know it doesn't get the RHI.
Yes, yeah. I was about to say that, and it does. You can't heat your hot water on it, can you?
No,
but no, I don't hear of it being done very often, to be honest, Michael. But and I'm sure partly that is because it doesn't get the RHI, and because it's not an all-encompassing sort of system. But it's interesting to hear that you know, that it, I think you said, did you say that it cost you less than £2,000?
Yes.
And you did it for one room, is that right?
Just one room, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not true that it does just one room. We keep the living room door open.
Yes.
And that means spare heat comes out of the living room, and the rest of the house is unheated at night, other than a wood stove in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And that way we can avoid running central heating. Our philosophy is to heat the rooms you want to be in.
Okay, no, that's interesting. And so the rest of the house, you don't have any other sort of formal heating system other than the wood burner, is that right?
Oh no, we have a proper gas-fired central heating system.
But you don't have to.
What we choose to do is to warm the house in the morning with 1.5 hours running, and then possibly in the darker, colder season, run it for an hour in the evening. Oh, again, okay, to make sure we've got plenty of background warmth. Yeah. But then to just heat the rooms we want to be in.
Yeah.
That seems to me illogical, to try and heat a whole house when, you know, you generally don't move around that much.
Yeah, it's only the way in which we tend to get around it is by having kind of TRVs around valve controls around the radiators, so you can move those and change it. So, for example, at the moment in running RS or heat pump, there are actually only 3 radiators in the house that are running just because it's not heating season. But having said that, Michael, I'm really interested in this. So, Tabitha, if you're in contact with Michael, could you send him my email, and maybe Michael, we could just get in contact, because as Natasha was saying, it's just not something that I see very often. But I'd be really interested. And funny enough, I'm quite involved in some of the community stuff, and we were just talking to someone in the community that was around, that was talking about a 92-year-old who I think really does. I mean, she does mainly live in one room, but actually talking about the challenge she's got and could we help her at all? And we're just talking as an example. I mean, that could be really interesting there. And I'll be honest, I've not seen really many case studies around it. I think because there's that element of a lot of people are looking at it as being the kind of whole, heating the whole house. But
exactly,
that's why we've kept our wood stove, because when it gets really cold, we actually love living in that. Yeah, when it's snow outside and it's really cold, living in that one room with a log burning stove on there, great, and it brings the family together and all sorts. So I'm really interested, Michael, if you're willing to share a bit of time to get a case study and just see how it works, because the reason why we don't share it more widely is there are very few people that have done it and feel it's good.
Yeah. And Michael, is the unit much smaller? What sort of size of unit is it?
Oh, yeah, I found myself slightly disagreeing with your sizes because of that. So it's about 1.2 meters wide, only about 60 centimeters, 50 or 60 wide, and maybe half a meter high. And it's immediately outside the living room window in the front garden.
Yeah.
And as you say, the noise is completely insignificant.
Yeah. And then it pushes warm air directly through the wall into the living room, does it?
No. The thermal fluid goes up to something that looks like a fairly conventional air conditioning system, which is in fact what it is. So in the summer, had we chosen to do it, we could have chilled our living room. Again, we just thought that was a waste of energy.
But that's interesting, isn't it, that you can do? And you have that sort of, essentially that unit is in the living room, is it?
Yeah, and then this is where you get case study point. I wanted to be a case study because I'm not sure I made the right choices. I said, from basic physics, I want the warm air coming out from a freestanding unit on the ground. and they're experienced at installing air conditioning, and they convinced me to go for it at higher level, and it's got the fans that beam it down.
Yeah.
I think it's a debatable point, but I saved money. I saved about £250, quality for like quality for like quality, by not having it on the ground.
Yeah. Well, like Tim, I would be very, as I've shown, I don't know enough about it, so I would be really interested in finding out more, actually.
No, I think it's the kind of thing where it would pay to have the knowledge spread around, and
yeah, definitely
more case studies probably.
Yeah, thanks, Michael.
Half a dozen case studies, couldn't you?
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Michael.
Is that all right?
That's great. I'll just send you Tim's and my email address, Michael, if you're happy to follow up.
That's very good. All right, thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you.
That's all right. So are you?
Oh, missed the last bit there. We have had another question from Marcus, who I think is still, yes, Marcus is still here. So Marcus is saying he has a very small house, 1 bed with storage heaters. Is that too small for an air source heat pump?
I don't think, well, I don't know, to be honest. I can't, I mean, I think it might be when you sort of cost it out, you might find that it's not very, from a cost, you know, an upfront cost perspective, that it's not very, that the cost is quite high compared to other alternatives. But I think you would, I think it would definitely be worth looking at it.
And maybe actually, if you can pass the details, once we have the case study from Michael, maybe, you know, is this a good example where that could work? Yeah.
And I think you've also got to, you know, you've got to take into, if it is a small property, you've got to take into account, you know, the fact you've got to have a hot water tank, and you know, there are there's sort of internal equipment that needs to go inside, so that could be, you know, that's definitely a consideration as well.
Great, thank you.
Have we exhausted the audience now?
Yeah, I think that actually is.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, we've still got 14 attendees, so we're doing well. But yeah, if anyone does have a question that you haven't wanted to ask, then do follow up with us. But yeah, I can't see anything else for now. Yeah, just thank yous, which is great. Okay, so I think we're good to close now. So thank you again, everyone, for coming, and Natasha and Tim for staying on for a bit as well. It's really great to have that discussion at the end. All right, I shall end the webinar then. But thank you both. Thank you, everyone else, for coming.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.